Hi, everyone. Welcome back to Comparative Talmudic Methodologies with Rabbi Yonah Hain. And thanks for being here again. Thank you, Rabbi Hain. Thank you, Yonah. And just again, I'm promoting people. I think at this point everyone's accepted, so I don't have to explain that again. But we do ask that you turn on your cameras if you are comfortable and turn off your microphones when you are not speaking. And any questions that you're not, if you want to ask a question, raise your hand, or if you are not comfortable speaking or watching on Facebook, just leave that in the comments or the chat and I'll pass those on. And yeah, thanks again for being here and looking forward to learning with you.
So, we have 4 or 5 weeks to learn together, and some of my closest relationships are specifically those with whom I study Torah. But I also want to get to know people a little bit. So, what's your guilty pleasure television? In the chat. And I specifically use guilty pleasure because, yeah, I like highbrow and I like lowbrow, and I don't really believe that one has to like one over the other, but they do exist. I don't even know what that is, Sarah. Oh, yeah, classic.
It's like, the Law and Order episodes,
Right.
or NCIS or FBI, any of those.
Great. Justin's obviously using the time productively, right? This sounds like someone who, correct me if I'm wrong, last week was in this class while driving.
I was actually on a NORPAC bus, so
Okay.
I was not driving.
Ooh, the movie trailers move. Well, for those of you who know my spouse, this will be more surprising, but we've seen every episode of Law and Order SVU. In the pandemic, 2 or 3 a night. And the reason why I say for my wife, it's more surprising because she's like a really brilliant scholar. Me, I'm like kind of a dirtbag who likes intellectual things, but And the reason why I mention this is because in another world, tonight's class would be called Law and Order or Criminal Intent. What we're going to do tonight is 3 different things. One, we're going to study a specific topic. That topic is going to be about the halachic principle, hatra'ah, warning. In the yeshiva, hasra. 2, in so doing, we are going to analyze the literary quality of Brightot and Memrot. Brightot are Tanaitic attributions within the Talmud, and Memrot are Amoraic attributions. And 3, what we're going to do is get into excavating specifically the question about attribution speakers, editors, redactors. Wait, can you see my arrow or only if I highlight? Yeah.
We can see the arrow.
You can see. Right, because I'll put it back up for everyone. Because as we laid the foundation in the first 2 sessions, there are 2 different ways that the world studies Talmud. There are many more, but there are 2, especially within Ashkenazi worlds, 2 mega outlooks: the historical critical and the yeshiva approach. And in the academy, we're very fixated on who said what. That's part of the historical attribution chain. That's part of the development of these materials. But in the yeshiva, we're going to be focused on the phenomena. What is the purpose of hatra'ah? We're focused on the essential, the conceptual. The attributions, those are more just opinions, not necessarily critical in our analysis. So we started off with all of these, and tonight we're going to focus on attribution speakers, editors, redactors, and sort of the conceptual and the essential. Thoughts, questions, challenges? Okay, now here's my warning. It was so nice. The first week we studied the beginning of Megillah. Are the different readings similar or different? Right? Oh, is the bracha last week before eating a please or a thank you? It's about to get a whole lot tougher tonight. Now we're going to get into the slog that is our Talmud. Now we're going to get into the hardcore trying to understand things. And what's even harder is we're going to try to detect the literary quality of the material while I have the burden of cherry picking. So we're going to try to share context, cherry pick the line, and then be able to extract the analysis. It's not easy, but I think we can do it. Chaya, did you have a question?
I did, but I guess it's really on last week's material, so I don't know if we should spend time on it. But actually,
Why
it
don't you
was not
send it to me and I can decide. You can do it privately.
oh, privately. Okay. All right. So it looks like Sarah's got a question, so maybe she can ask it while I'm.
Please, Sarah.
I might be jumping the shark, so ignore me if I am, but I read a book by Noah Bickert, Rabbi Noah Bickert, about how the Greek influence on the stam made it more in agreement with Greek arguments of style.
That's a valuable tool in analyzing, especially argumentation. Were you referencing anything in particular that we've mentioned?
My Hebrew and Aramaic are not good enough to do that.
Okay. So we're going to start, and we're going to follow a nice little Tanaitic rule. When you read biblical literature, there is no concept of a warning. There's no notion that witnesses or the court needs a warning. There's no notion that, excuse me, ugh, trust me, it's not you. It's not me either, but it's Columbia. There's no notion that sinning means you were warned. Okay? So Tanaitic literature comes along and says, we have a process, we have a warning, and what we're going to see here is trickling in of information about the warning. And this is going to be an amazing example of the yeshiva versus the academic. Like, one of the things we're going to see is an opinion of Rabbi Yossi Rabbi Yehuda. And Chaya asked, hey, don't attributions matter to see consistency, even if it's about the conceptual? And the answer is sure. But in the conceptual method, we're less interested in one opinion over the other and more trying to better appreciate where each is coming from. Right? That's how the lomdus approach pivoted from its predecessors. Right? The pill-pull notion, or what was going on in the 18th century, early 19th, in the yeshivas was, there are two sides, and I'm going to now encounter that which came before me and try to bring proof to one side or the other. And the yeshiva revolution, the analytic philosophy said, we're not going to choose between them. We're going to reframe what they are actually arguing about. So I'm not going to try to prove whether I have to recite a bracha on a tiny amount or if there's a standard. What I'm going to do is tell you what's animating both of those positions. So the attributions are important only insofar as you might paint a fuller picture of a conceptual analysis, and we'll see that here. But in the developmental approach, attributions are critical. Is this the same person, or is this the same, or have they now pivoted? So let's start. Now, when we I lost my numbers. That's annoying. Sorry. When we talk about Tanaitic material, right, we have a number of sources from which we can receive Tanaitic teachings. Obviously, we have the Mishnah, right? That's kind of the foundational one. But then we also have Tosefta, right? And scholars have somewhat of a debate of exactly what in the heck is happening there. We just are going to go numberless. What exactly is the Tosefta, right? It's a parallel, a little bit later Tanaitic corpus. We also have Midrash Halacha, right? Tanaitic Midrash, the Mechilta, the Sifra, the Sifrei. But then we also have Tanaitic teachings from within the Talmuds, right? Ditanya, Vahatnan, or that's usually a Mishnah. Tanu Rabbanan. These can be things that appear in Mishnayot or Toseftot or Midrash Halacha, or they can be separate transmissions. So we're going to see now a Mishnah, Tosefta, and then a Breita, our Mishnah. So when discussing the examination of the witnesses, the Mishnah in the 5th chapter of Sanhedrin says, Hayubotkin otan b'sheva chakirot. What are the 7 chakirot? Be'ez shavua, be'ez shana, be'ez chodesh, b'kam b'chodesh, be'ez yom, be'ez shah, be'ez makom. So there are 7 key interrogations that get the core data that we're trying to get at. Right? So which year, which month, bless you, whoever that was, bless you, whoever needs to mute. What time did it happen and where? Rabbi Yossi Amar, af be'ez yom, be'ez shah. Oh, sorry, I added. Be'ez makom. I added, sorry. Initially, it was, just what month and what time and what day. Rabbi Yossi also adds, not just that, but makir matemoto. Do you recognize the person? Hitre tembo. Did you give them warning? Ha'oved avodah zara mi avad u'b'mei avad. What were the details of the crime? So here we see that there's a notion of hatra'ah. Why do you think halacha requires hatra'ah? Let's do yeshiva learning. The first move is seeing the halacha and asking, what is its essence? Our first move is, what is the conceptual framework animating this position? What is the purpose of hatra'ah? Good.
To prevent someone from sinning.
We got 2 different notions. One is to establish intent, right? Debbie's a sharp student, always knows the thing you check first is the title of the source sheet or the intro to the class. Law and order, criminal intent. All right? It's about establishing intent. Good. But Sarah had a little bit of a different emphasis. It's actually preventative. How is it preventative?
Well, if you warn someone that they're about to do something bad, they might not do it.
Okay, but let's say I do it without the warning. Shouldn't I still be punished?
Well, I guess if there's no one around there to warn you, then guilt kind of, if there are people around who didn't warn you, then guilt is sort of more widespread. If there's no one around to warn you, then I guess you can't be warned, and therefore you shouldn't be punished for not be warned.
Why not?
Well, it's not Torah law, for starters. It's rabbinic. Right?
Well, yeah, but the rabbis, remember, there's this fluid relationship. Much of what they share carries the legal status of biblical.
So they
Right,
might
what
not
they-
be, they might not be punished in this world, but they'll be punished in the next world.
Okay, so what Sarah points out is even if you don't have proper warning, the crime is still committed and you'll get yours. I want to go back to, though, this question. If I don't give warning, why are we not punishing? So Debbie said, we haven't established intent. Anybody have another reason?
I think you have to know that the person knows that they're committing the sin. If
Isn't
they
that
never,
intent?
it is intent that you intend to do what you're doing, but it's not intent that you know that it's necessarily a sin.
It's almost like you want them to have kavanah.
Well, unless a person, well, there are certain things you can assume that everybody knows are wrong, but then there are other things that you don't make that assumption.
This is great. You have a very Talmudic mind. These all come up in the various topics that are covered in rabbinic literature. One notion is to establish intent. Okay. But I want to go back to Sarah. Sarah said it's trying to prevent them, right? Maybe this is just a requirement of the court because we don't want the court to be stepping beyond their lane. It's checks and balances. We don't want the court to be a bloody court, right? It's not a matter of intent. It's more a matter of law and order. The warning is less for the perpetrator and more for the courts. That is
So do you only-
conceptually, one
So do you
second,
only-
Miriam,
okay.
1 second. That changes fundamentally what we're trying to do here. And as we look at the different facets of hatra'ah, let's see, is that more intent oriented or is that more process oriented, right? The courts have many rules, right? They don't accept testimony at night. You have to be standing when you do the testimony, right? Maybe you need warning in order to generate a punishment. It's not to establish intent of the violator, but rather it's part of the court's protocols to exact a punishment. Miriam.
Okay, I was just wondering, do you only need a warning for capital crimes or for lesser crimes as well?
No, lesser crimes
monetary.
as well. Lesser crimes as well. It's actually an interesting here, let me
Because
pull it up.
it feels a little weird. I totally understand needing guardrails so you don't get a kangaroo court going around and murdering people. But you know, if you're just assigning damages, it seems less important.
So in the Mishnah and Tosefta, Hatra only appears in death penalty cases. In Amoraic literature and in all of the legal halachic codes, Hatra is required in instances of regular punishments, which are lashes as well. Now, part of what you're saying is really sharp, namely, the scope of Hatra'ah might reflect its character, right? Maybe we're only worried about a kangaroo court in certain contexts, right? But I could flip that just as easily, Miriam, right? Maybe I only need to establish this degree of intent in capital punishment cases. So each data point can have two different expressions, right? Not always do we have what's called a nafka mina, a difference practically between the two. Sometimes a big difference between our conceptual understandings resides in the fact that we have different orientations towards the same phenomena. So let's see what else is in Talmudic literature about Hatra'ah, if it feels more for the perpetrator or for the court. In the Tosefta, things pick up. And we see V'shar chayve mito beitin ein mechayven otan LLP edim v'hatra'ah, and all capital offenses need witnesses and warning. Not just that though. V'ad sheyodiuhu shechayav mita bebeitin. You can't just say don't commit murder. You have to say Don't commit murder for which you will be punished. Rabbi Yossi, Rabbi Yehuda Omer, Achi diu be'ezemita who made. I have to tell you what you're doing is wrong. I have to tell you that you're going to be punished, and I have to be knowledgeable enough to know which death penalty you'll get. Therefore, that the courts can issue. Number 2, matrin bo v'shotek. If they warn the perpetrator and they're silent, matrin bo umarchin et rosha, right? Or there's a nod, or they warn the perpetrator, and afal pisha amar yodea ani, they say, okay, I got it. Hutter. They are not liable for the death penalty. Ad sheyomer yodeani v'almenat kain ani osa. You need to say that I'm doing it despite this. I know, and I'm transgressing anyway. Then they give the example of this. And if you look at number 5 or hey, Rabbi Yossi Omer, Hare shehitro ba'atzma pater. If you issue the warning yourself, that won't work. Right? Here you, I'm about to commit this crime, and I know that this one, and I know, you know. Shenemar la not bo sarah. Sheyitra hu ba'achirim v'lo sheyitra hu ba'atzmo. Okay, we don't have to get into it exactly, but the witnesses are against them, right? The perpetrator, it has to be someone else. So here we have a Tosefta that adds a wrinkle or two. You have to inform them that they're subject to the death penalty. And Rabbi Yosef, Rabbi Yehuda says you have to inform them of which death. And then Rabbi Yossi, Rabbi Yehuda also later on, or at least Rabbi Yossi later on says, you have to give the hatra from others. Now, what do you think? Law and order is part of a formal process, or establishing criminal intent? Sarah, I'll get to you in a second. Do you think these details feed into one or the other, or do we perhaps need a third understanding? Yeah, Debbie.
I think that here there's so many of them that it almost seems silly. Like, I'm not watching a murder or Shabbat breaking and like suddenly got out my dictionary and like citing the rules about it. It just doesn't seem plausible that this would ever happen, which lends more to the law and order argument, because it would never happen. So there's never going to be a situation that warrants being punished.
Interesting. What else? I think the nevertheless requirement, that one's very intense. Right? Because that's more than just intent. Right? And that's more than just, you know, some requirement of a court. Sarah, what are you thinking?
So it reminded me a lot of Baba Metzia, which if you follow Daf Yomi, that's where we are. And in commercial transactions, if you don't state even the details, it's as if you said nothing, right? And it feels like that's the same template that's being applied here. But I do agree that it is to save the court from being a bloody court.
It's interesting. Look, I could say that it's kind of this combo of intent, but also trying to be a deterrent, you know, and that's why we go so extreme. But there's a third idea that emerges. And the third idea is that we are not necessarily doing this for the court, nor is it for intent, but actually part of what you are punished for is the rebellious nature of your act. It's establishing that this is not just violating Shabbat, which according to the Jewish courts is punishable by death. It's not just that you are murderous. It's that you are also rejecting God. And in this act, you're saying, I know I'm doing it nevertheless. So we actually have three categories: establishing intent, creating the rebellious nature of the murderous act, or a formality of the court. So now let's see the Talmudic. Sarah, do you still have a question, or is it just your hands from before? Evelyn, please.
It seems that using this formula creates a situation where you're going to have more sinners than you would ordinarily, because there's so many outs, so many ways you can say, oh, but that detail wasn't fulfilled and that detail wasn't fulfilled. So you've got so many more criminals, or what I don't want to call them criminals, sinners, potentially.
Yeah, more sinners than people who are punishable. 100%.
It's easier, you'll take your chances,
You're right. Let's see it continue.
I had something I
Please,
can
Rich.
jump in later. I guess I don't know if this is a third category exactly, but I'm thinking about the witnesses themselves. And unlike in our secular legal worlds, it's like, so it makes me think of like the Miranda rights. The cops screw up the Miranda rights, the whole case could be thrown out. And that's not that's not a ridiculous standard because they're trained to do that. But I forget who was saying it. It makes it almost impossible for a neighbor to turn someone in, basically.
Yeah, to know which of the penalties you'll get.
And it has this like, we're all responsible for each other, like kol arivin zelazah, but there's like a limit. Like we don't want to also enact
Totally.
Yeah, have the court enact our hatred of each other or whatever.
Yeah. Lisa.
I'm just wondering if we'll learn the mechanism of how this warning is delivered and by whom.
So it's by the witnesses, and it needs to be before the act has been perpetrated. Let's see the version in the Talmud. Let's see if this is helpful. Tanu Rabbanan. The sages taught in a Braita that the witnesses are asked the following questions. Makir metemoto. Do you recognize this accused? Nachri harag. Who was the victim? Was it a Jew or a Gentile? Hetretembo. Did you give them proper warning? Kibel alav hatra. Did they accept the hatra? Hitir atzmo lemita. Did they release themselves to death? Hitir, like a heter, mutar, permissible. Did they say, I can be killed? Hemit betoch kedei dibor. Did it happen immediately? Right? Was the warning followed by the action right away? Now, are these features establishing intent, establishing a permission for the court to kill, creating a rebellious action? I think each of them can be parsed differently. Okay, Sarah.
So does the Talmud have any notion of crimes of the heart?
Say more.
Well, I think in American law, if you are crazed by some emotion, you get maybe life in jail instead of death penalty. It's a mitigating factor. I'll just say that.
There are certain parallels, but I don't think I know enough about the American version to
Come on, you
comment
watch Law and
properly.
Order. You've got a law degree.
So we're going to see something where the law is not one size fits all. which is a parallel to what you're discussing. We're actually going to see a number of exceptions here, but specifically that we're going to get to a case where it's manslaughter, but what if that person was a known enemy? And a debate if maybe that would, so, but that's not really mitigating circumstances. It's actually the opposite. That makes you more liable. So I'm not equipped to answer. Okay, now we're going to get into the really hard stuff. Everyone ready? Again, so far we've done a half an hour of conceptual analysis. It's really nice. You can go home and say, oh, there are 3 different ideas behind what animates hatra'ah. Is it the intent? Is it the rebellious act? Or is it a formality for the court in order to punish? But now we're going to get into the literary quality of this material. And it's hard. In discussing hitir atzmo lemita, the fact that you have to accept your fate, the Talmud asks minalan, from where do we know that you have to say, I am accepting death upon myself, release themselves to death? It was either Rav or Chizkiah who taught the dual formulation that when there are witnesses, so then yumat hamet, the guilty will be killed, but it's yumat hamet, right? Which happens all the time. You know, hikaret tikaret or rapo yirape. Ad shiatir atzmo lemita. The death cannot happen until they've accepted it. Now, we could spend a long time because we're all experts in rabbinic sources, right? The sourcing of laws. What are the implications from this exegesis? We don't have time for it. Amar Rav Hanan said, what about a betrothed woman who had conspiring witnesses against her? So 2 witnesses made something up about her that would have put her to death, but they were found out to not just be liars, but they weren't there altogether. So we say those witnesses, even though they should inherit the death they plotted for her, ein neheragin. They're not killed. Why? They have this out. Mitoch sheyicholim lomar la'osra al ba'ala banu. Because we were only trying to get her to be separated from her husband. If she had cheated, she wouldn't be allowed to be with her husband. So we weren't trying to be murderous witnesses. We were conspiring to get her separated. The Talmud challenges, Vaha atruba. But they were warned that they would be killed if they were lying. Delo atruba. There was no warning. Ve'ilo atruba hechi mikatla. So how could there ever be a case where someone might be put to death without warning? And that is all that matters. Everything that came before, you can skip. We've now arrived in the next 24 minutes. We're going to discuss this possibility. Someone's put to death without warning. How could that be? Bi'isha chaveira. Because we're talking about a case of witnesses who are of a certain status. They are, sorry if I can try to get the English for folks. They are what's called a chaver, an associate, knowledgeable in Torah. Okay. Valiba de Rabbi Yossi Rabbi Yehuda. And it's according to, right, we know this name, Rabbi Yossi Rabbi Yehuda. Rabbi Yossi Rabbi Yehuda had a lot of opinions in the Tosefta, right? You needed to know exactly what death. You need to say, you know, I'll do it nevertheless. This is a liba de Rabbi Yossi Rabbi Yehuda, Ditanya. For we learned in a Braita. Rabbi Yossi Rabbi Yehuda Omer Chaver Ein Tzarech Hatra. Someone who is knowledgeable in Torah doesn't need hatra. Lefi shelo nitna hatra el lahavchim bein shogeg lemezim. Don't worry about that convoluted case that we were talking about. This is where we are now. If you are knowledgeable, do you have the same expectations? Or no, you don't need hatra'ah. Because hatra'ah was only given lavchin bein shogeg lamezid. Now, in our conceptual analysis, so what is that saying? Is that saying a chaver doesn't need hatra'ah because they always have intent? Does a chaver not need hatra'ah because they know the rebellious nature? It's probably harder to argue that a Torah scholar does not need warning because the courts, right? It doesn't really work for the courts. If warning is dependent on the perpetrator, it's probably about the perpetrator and their intent or action. But let's turn our literary caps on. This position doesn't appear in the Mishnah or Tosefta, right? We have, Rabbi Yossi Omer, we asked, did you give them warning? All right, Rabbi Yossi's always adding warning. Even if Rabbi Yossi is not the same as Rabbi Yossi, Rabbi Yehuda, here we have Rabbi Yossi, Rabbi Yehuda saying you have to say which death, right? And it has to be Afapi Shomer Yodeani. It's until Almanat Kenani Yoseh. Or Rabbi Yossi, Rabbi Yehuda required a very specific, had very specific features, but this wasn't one of them. So in the development of halakha and of these materials, it could be that these are just different transmissions that got recorded in different materials. The Mishnah picked up one thing, Tosefta picked up a few others, and this Breita has yet another. But it's interesting to note that it doesn't appear elsewhere. What else do you notice? Is there anything else interesting about the Breita? Ditanya, Rabbi Yossi, Rabbi Yehuda Omer, Chaver ein tzarech hatra. Lefi shelo nitna hatra lahavchen bein shogeg. A Torah scholar doesn't need warning because it's only there in order to establish intentional and unintentional. There's no flip side, right? There's no position that says explicitly Chaver tzarich hatra. Right? It's one of these like Rabbi Yossi, Rabbi Yehuda addendum positions on warning. So now let's look at Rambam. Rambam does something different. Who wants to read for us? I gotta make this bigger so I see everyone. Who wants to read? Maimonides, Laws of Sanhedrin, 12:2.
I'll do it.
Thank you, Sarah.
Both scholars and one who is ignorant require hatra'ah, for hatra'ah is only given to distinguish between unintentional and intentional. Perhaps they were unintentional. How is hatra'ah?
You want to read that one more time?
Okay. Both scholars and one who is ignorant require hatra'ah, for hatra'ah is only given to distinguish between unintentional and intentional. Perhaps they were unintentional.
Is he following Rabbi Yossi, Rabbi Yehuda or not? Let's read it in the Hebrew.
I can't.
Echad Talmid Chachamim ve'echad Am Haaretz tzarech hatra'ah. Shelo nitna hatra'ah el lahavchen bein shogeg lamezid. Shema shogeg haya. Someone tell me what Rabbi Yossi, Rabbi Yehuda's opinion was.
His opinion was that does not need hatra'ah.
And what was Rabbi Yossi, Rabbi Yehuda's reasoning?
Because You could tell that he knows, because he's able to understand.
Yeah, it's about
between shogeg
distinguishing.
and Mezid.
Yeah.
So meaning it innately, the chaver would know between the two. And here it's saying, we can't say whether somebody knows between the two, even if they are knowledgeable.
One
There's
second.
no
You're a step ahead.
categorical.
You're a step ahead. You're a step ahead.
Yeah.
Does Maimonides quote Rabbi Yossi, Rabbi Yehuda's reasoning? Lefi shelo nitna hatra'a ela lahavkin ben shogeg lemezid?
He's saying everybody requires it.
Maimonides pulls a fast one here.
It's like the same
Rambam.
reason with a different conclusion.
Exactly. Rambam says everyone requires hatra, even a scholar. Lefi shelo nitna hatra'a ela lahavkin ben shogeg lemezid. He wants to have his cake and eat it too. He takes the verdict of Rabbi Yossi, Rabbi Yehuda and casts it aside, but he uses his very own, the very same reasoning. This is a classic Maimonidean maneuver.
He's
He
acknowledging that
jettisons Rabbi Yossi, Rabbi Yehuda's conclusion, but cites his reasoning. Yes, Sarah.
I was going to say, Maimonides thinks that scholars and whoever, Haaretz or it's somewhere in between, everybody's subject to crimes of the heart. Meaning
How do
one
you
law
see
for
that from?
one law for everyone.
But his reasoning is not one law for everyone. His reasoning is that hatra'ah should apply. What's his version? If hatra'ah is about intent, so we have the intent, right? They know the difference.
Maybe not in a crazed state.
Okay.
Purim, right?
Yeah. From an analytical philosophy perspective here, I think he has some defiance, Esther. You're right. I think it's possible to see that Shema Shogeg Haya, that perhaps they were unintentional. Right? Maybe it's crafting warning as being part of the action. Right? Let's look at the continuation of Maimonides. It's very strange. Let's read it in English.
How is Hatorah administered? We tell them, desist or do not do it. It's a transgression, and you are liable to be executed by the court or to receive lashes for it. If they cease, they are not liable. Similarly, if they remain silent or nod their head, they are not liable for punishment. Even if they say, I know, they are not liable for punishment until they accept death upon themselves, saying, it is for this reason that I am doing this. In such a situation, they are executed.
What does Maimonides add? What case? That was not in the Tosefta.
Lashes?
Sure, good. He explicitly talks about you give hatra'ah and they stop. It's strange that he considers that as similar, remotely similar, someone who commits murder but doesn't go through the acceptance of the warning. He likens piresh. He likens not committing the crime to committing the crime without accepting the warning. I think from a lomdus yeshiva perspective, you could see Rambam establishing hatra'ah as part of the action. And that way I can liken not committing murder to committing murder without hatra'ah. Both are shortcomings with regards to the murderous, rebellious action required.
So what's the point of
Is it
Hatorah then?
Hatra is about establishing a murderous, rebellious action.
But if you don't do it, then you're still liable. Then
No,
what's
you're
the-
not liable without it. Time out. I want to acknowledge something. This is a stretch.
Yeah,
Welcome to the yeshiva. Now let's go with another approach. What if maybe Rambam had a historical critical way of seeing this? So we have nowhere across the rabbinic corpus where we see someone say, you require hatra'ah for a scholar because hatra'ah was only given lahavchim ben shogim meit. There is no precedent for that. Furthermore, there's no opinion that even explicitly states chaver tzarich hatra'ah. How did Rambam get to this? So let's look at the literary quality, the characteristics of this Breita. Scholars debate, could it be that maybe the editors of the Talmud made up Breita? I'm not comfortable wholesale saying yes, but it could be that we see editorial glosses by Babylonian editors or even Amoraic teachings, right? The transmission of Tannaitic teachings through the generations of Amoraic discourse might have contained some edits, or certainly the redactors of the Talmud. So let's look at where else we see this opinion. There are two general contexts in which we find our Breita of the chaver eino tzarich hatra'ah. All but one of them are cases where we forego hatra'ah, right? Like here, we're talking about a case where how could you kill them without hatra'ah? We didn't kill them. We didn't warn these witnesses, and it's according to the opinion that says you don't need to kill. You don't need hatra'ah to kill a chaver. So let's see some of these other ones. Is everyone with me? This is the hard stuff. A little bit no. Someone give me a yes or a no. We're seeing where we go with it. Actually, let me telegraph it. I think if we look at the literary characteristic of this Breita, Rambam may have rejected it as a true Tannaitic teaching. And therefore, he might have gotten off scot-free by accepting the reasoning of Rabbi Yossi, Rabbi Yehuda. The purpose of hatra'ah is to distinguish, but jettisoning Rabbi Yossi, Rabbi Yehuda's conclusion, and instead saying, even a scholar requires hatra'ah. Now, I want to demonstrate how perhaps Rambam saw that the literary quality of this Breita might not be capturing a Tannaitic teaching. It might be a later gloss. Evelyn.
So, when the need to give hatra'ah is qualified by whether you're a chaver or not, it's not objective, because then you have to say, okay, what makes him a chaver?
Totally. I think, though, the opinion that says you don't need to give the hatra'ah is already dealing in subjectives, or at least not one size fits all. But it's a fair question. Okay, let's look at some of the other places that it comes up. So, did I accidentally close it? No, it's right here. Here we go. Let's see where else this Breita appears. So the Breita in Makot 6b appears because there they're discussing the opinion of Rabbi Yossi in the Mishnah that it must be the witnesses that deliver the hatra'ah. Amrle Rav Papa Labai. Everyone see where I am? Makot 6b. Amrle Rav Papa Labai. Mi itle Rabbi Yossi Hai Svara. Is it true that Rabbi Yossi required the witnesses to be the ones who delivered the warning? Va'anan tanan Rabbi Yossi Omer Asoni Nerag Mneshu Kamuad. In a case of manslaughter, there are certain exceptions to going to the city of refuge. Right? Some don't even need to go to a city of refuge, and others don't even get to go to a city of refuge. They're put to death. So in a case where this was a known enemy and it's manslaughter, that's considered already like proof. And this person is like forewarned. So Rabbi Yossi here is saying you don't need warning if you accidentally or manslaughter your enemy, you're put to death. But I thought Rabbi Yossi, Rabbi Yehuda required warning. Who Rabbi Yossi, Rabbi Yehuda, Titania, Rabbi Yossi, Rabbi Yehuda, Chaver Omer Ein Tzarech Hatra. Fishaloni Natra Lahavchem Introdum. The person who doesn't require hatra is Rabbi Yossi, Rabbi Yehuda. Rabbi Yossi would. What is happening from a literary style? What is happening from a literary style is that our Breita has no home. There's no locus classicus. There's no place where we're just teaching this. There's no Tanu Rabbanan. Here's a machloket about hatra. It's always being brought in from elsewhere. It's always coming to advance. Oh, we don't need hatra. That's according to that position. Or if you look, the most convoluted example is the next source, Sanhedrin 8b. This one's very convoluted. But our discussion of Chaver Eino Tzarech Hatra appears in a long-winded series of proposed attributed resolutions to the circumstances of the first Mishnah in Sanhedrin, where a defamer, the Motzi Shemra, either requires 3 or 23 judges. And so there, Rav Papa suggests maybe we're talking about a chaver and they don't require hatra. But again, there's never a classic context in which we just learn chaver tzarech o eino tzarech hatra. It's always brought in from left field. It's always, what I would say is what emerges that the literary character of our Breita is ambiguous. It shows up very differently from the other Tanaitic Hatra'ah material in the Mishnah and Tosefta and the Talmuds, right? So again, it could be there were different traditions of the Tanaim, and some made their way into the Mishnah and some in the Tosefta, and this teaching about Hatra only made its way into the Babylonian Talmud. But maybe what happened is the Babylonian Talmud, the Amoraim, and its editors were working in a literary atmosphere in which sayings from earlier times had become sort of the property of later scholars. Not saying that it's a fictitious Breita, but Rabbi Yossi, Rabbi Yehuda was known as someone who added rules about Hatra'ah, and what emerged was this kind of teaching. Maybe it was a rabbi who came up with it. It somehow became attributed to Rabbi Yossi, Rabbi Yehuda. And maybe for Rambam, he sees this Breita as not being like an essential Tanaitic or even Amoraic teaching. And he's willing to separate the rule and the rationale. Let's look at one more source to bring this home. Okay? There's a textual parallel to our Breita. This is the last source on the page. There, the Talmud is dealing with someone who transgressed based on an erroneous ruling of the court, which the court itself subsequently reversed. So the court says A, you do A, and then they say we should have done B. So if I followed the court, do I have to bring a sacrifice of atonement? No one would say that you're a bad person. But do I need to bring the chatat? Or no? And there are two opinions. So we say no in the Mishnah, right? You're following the court. There are two reasons. We're going to look at the second reason. Second reason. Ika de Amri. Amar of Yehuda Amarav. Omer Haya Rabbi Shimon or Rabbi Shmuel. Oh, Rabbi Shimon. Okay? Rabbi Shimon used to say, Kol Hora'ah Shepashta Berov Tzibor. Any ruling that was made with the masses, V'chazru Bahen, and they rejected, V'halach Yachid V'asa, and an individual did it, Pater. They are exempt. Lefi Shelo Nitna Hora Ela Lahavchin Ben Shogeg Lamezid. Because their ruling, their Hora'ah, was only given to distinguish between Shogeg and Mezid. Now that's kind of similar, right? Obviously, Hora'ah and Hatra'ah can be easily swapped. This is the only other context in the entire Babylonian Talmud where we see that formulation of Lo Nitna Elalavchin Ben Shogeg Lamezid. And what I think this demonstrates, it speaks to a literary pattern in the Babylonian Talmud to use this particular phrase, right? Maybe this version is imported for our teaching and our version is an authentic transmission. But maybe what's happening here is the teaching in Horiot reveals that this formulation was a product of the scholarly environment of Babylonian Talmud and the editors, and not part of that original Tannaitic teaching. Look, it could be that Rabbi Yosef, Rabbi Yehuda said it, and the Horiot Sugya is just working off that. But it also could reveal that this was a turn of phrase that was indisposed in the formation of the Talmud. And maybe according to Rambam, he's willing to jettison the connection between Rabbi Yosef, Rabbi Yehuda's ruling and reasoning. I know this was hard. I know this was a lot. But what we've done tonight is we've examined the analytic philosophy of Hatra'ah, 3 ideas animating it. And then we specifically looked at an exception, the Chaver Chaverah, and how Rambam seemed to separate the reason and the rule. From an analytic philosophy standpoint, we gave an answer, but it was kind of difficult. From a literary, historical, critical lens, perhaps what we're looking at is a Breita that doesn't necessarily measure up to being a fully Tannaitic transmission. Doesn't appear anywhere else. Rambam already separates between the two. It never has its like light of day. It's always just brought in. And elsewhere, we see this similar turn of phrase being deployed. If this was hard, if this was a struggle, if this was a slog, 1, welcome to Talmud. 2, it was a function of the ambition. And please, I'm open to feedback of, hey, let's just do one at a time. Let's not try to do both each week. But 3, part of comparative methodologies in Talmud is about embracing how each one is difficult and how it's not just learning Gemara is hard, to then be able to do analyses and to do 2 different types. This is hard stuff. So thanks for sticking with it.
Okay, thank you. Oh, sorry. Looks like we have a question from Sarah. Do you have another moment? Yonah,
Yeah.
or-
Let's do it after Sarah. Chaya, can you keep the Zoom open?
Yeah, sure, totally. Thank you. Thank you to everyone who joined us. Thank you, Yonah. And looking forward to next week. We have one more week, right? Or more? 2 more weeks. Oh, okay, great. Thank you. Sorry, I thought this might be the last one. Here. Okay, so 2 more weeks of this class, but see you all next week. And also please do check out drisha.org, where we have many, many wonderful classes on right now, as well as I think you've got about a week and a half left to register. 2 more weeks. Thank you again. I think there's about a week and a half left to register for Drisha Summer Kollel, which is really exciting. It's going to be online this year, and really Gemara in the morning, all sorts of fascinating topics in the afternoon. So do check that out and pass on the word. And thank you again for learning with us. And thank you again to Yonah, and see you all very soon. And now we'll just take that last question.
Thanks all.